Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guests today on the Cognitive Crucible are Mr. Sam Bendett, who is an advisor with the Center for Naval Analyses Strategy, Policy, Plans, and Programs Center. Sam's research focuses on the Russian military autonomy and AI, Russian defense industrial capabilities, and emerging technologies. Also joining us today is Jeff Edmonds, who is an expert on Russia and Eurasia. He too is a senior research scientist with the Center for Naval Analyses Strategy, Policy, Plans, and Programs Center. And Jeff's research focuses on the Russian military, foreign policy, Russian threat perceptions, and Russian information and cyber operations. And by the way, Jeff was also the project manager for the report that we are going to be discussing today. Jeff Edmonds and Sam Bendett, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having us, John.
So gentlemen, the conversation that I'd like to have with you today centers around your recent CNA piece that you co-authored, which is called Artificial Intelligence and Autonomy in Russia. And for our listeners, of course, we will have a link to this in the show notes. But before we get into the actual report, could one of you please share with our audience what the Center for Naval Analyses is? And by the way, you might hear us also refer to this as CNA. What CNA is and how it figures into national security in general.
CNA is a federally funded research and development center, an FFRDC, which means all of our projects and money come from the government. We do a lot of work for the Navy, but we also work with other departments and agencies, just like this report was done for the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. Within CNA, the Russia Studies Program resides in the Strategy, Policy, and Plans and Programs Division. And with 8+ full-time Russia analysts and researchers, arguably we have one of the largest Russia teams in the think tank community.
Got it. Great. And you mentioned just a moment ago the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center initiative that is coming online right now, sponsored by DoD. And so that was the sponsoring organization for this work, right?
That's correct.
Great. So but before we get into the heart of this piece that was just published, I wanted to maybe set the stage just a little bit more. In one of our previous podcast episodes, we had George Beebe, who is a former CIA analyst and also a Russian expert. And George describes the overall Russian strategic posture as somewhat paranoid or worried about NATO encroachment, as well as losing prestige on the world stage. And this kind of overview percolates into their presentation to the world. Does this general outlook comport with your observations as well?
Yes, I think it does. I think that the Russians are rather hyperbolic about both U.S. intentions and U.S. capabilities. The political and military leadership are definitely convinced that the United States seeks to keep Russia contained, marginalized, and weak. And that our usual practice is to foment instability and drive regime change in countries whose foreign policy is not amenable to U.S. interests. And so they definitely think that the U.S. intends at some point, or is just kind of continually trying to weaken the Russian state, so that at some point we can get somebody into power that is more, like I said, amenable to U.S. interests. I mean, of course, that's not what we're doing, but they definitely see the U.S. and NATO and Europe through that lens.
And certainly when it comes to the military investments, Russia's Western Military District and Southern Military District usually get more modern weapons, and a lot of training is conducted there because those military districts are actually facing NATO. And so Russia is heavily invested in its own regions that face their perceived threat, which is NATO and the United States.
Okay, great. That makes a lot of sense. I want to start stepping into the report now, and I want to read a very short passage, which is at the very beginning of the report, and ask you to talk about that. So I'm going to quote now. So the goals of Russia's AI and autonomous ecosystem are best understood within the context of Russia's economic development and modernization efforts, and include those initiatives aimed at the improvement of the well-being of Russian citizens, as well as the conditions for business and entrepreneurial activity. There's a lot to unpack there. So could we perhaps start with the word autonomy? What do you mean by autonomy? This is a word that I've been hearing more and more. Why is there such a focus on this capability? And also, just in general, introduce the piece to us, please.
Yeah, so I think the sentence here you're talking about is really kind of capturing the fact that the report focused a lot on AI and autonomy in particular, obviously, and a lot on security. But in order to really capture that, we had to place it within the larger framework in Russia. What kind of technological environment do you do AI and autonomy in? What is, how technologically savvy is the population? What's the population's attitude towards AI and autonomy? How is the government legally coming up with a framework in which you can have an innovative environment? How are they addressing challenges? And so that was really, the report grew to be this kind of, what we really think is the most comprehensive look at AI and autonomy and how it fits into really the Russian industrial, political, military framework. And as far as like autonomy goes, Sam is well known for his expertise in autonomy and AI. So Sam, I'll hand it over to you for the autonomy part.
Russian government is in the midst of a massive digitization drive right now. So it's trying to sell this initiative to the Russian population as an advantage going forward, so that the Russian economy becomes more modern, more digital, so that new industries can be developed, so that the Russian society in general can be more efficient, so that the relationship between the government and the population can be more efficient. And therefore, Russian society and economy writ large have to be digitized. And so the government is kind of pushing this down to the regional and local levels, that the introduction of digital technologies, artificial intelligence is going to make people's lives more efficient. It is going to make things better going forward. When it comes to military autonomy, specifically, Russians have been actually investing in it probably since around 2010, 2011, at the start of the military modernization drive after the war of 2008 with Georgia. And so there are multiple initiatives taking place across the Ministry of Defense, across the Russian military industrial complex, and across the MOD enabled institutions. Russian military has stood up multiple initiatives that in many ways mirror image those of the United States. And they are actually looking at autonomy to make the warfighting and their military missions more effective, more capable, by removing human soldiers from actual combat and by trying to minimize civilian casualties. So they think military autonomy is going to make that possible.
So a touch point for their autonomy efforts sounds like it is maybe military in origin, but they've got kind of a whole of society initiative going on here to have it go well beyond just military applications. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say origin. I would say that there's more focus on semi-autonomous and autonomous systems in the military. But there are other really interesting examples of autonomy, whether it's in industry or they spend a fair amount of time looking at vehicles and different platforms that can do things in the Arctic, for example, like inspect pipelines or explore fields and things of that nature that are just very harsh for humans to do. And so you'll see that pop up quite a bit. I mean, they spend quite a bit of energy in looking at how autonomy can assist them in some of the more remote areas of Russia and in their critical infrastructure.
Got it. So perhaps we could touch on some of your main points in your paper. So how does Russia see the emergence of military autonomy? And would you say that there is a difference from sentiments and developments in the United States and elsewhere? Kind of compare and contrast, I guess.
Well, we've actually noticed a very interesting sort of logical arc. On the one hand, Russian military considers human in the loop as the overarching approach to the development of military autonomy in the short to medium term. In the long term, however, Russian military thinks that fully autonomous systems should be and could be fielded and should be able to actually operate on its own in multiple conflicts. What's actually missing is that sort of the connecting arc. How do we get from human in the loop, from humans controlling autonomous systems to actually autonomous systems performing all tasks on their own? There are some hints maybe that we have traced in writings that have been published in Russian military academies that the development of military technology and military autonomy is going to basically proceed from humans giving directions to a certain system, to that system and fulfilling that task fully autonomously once a human approved the target. But as of now, Russian military officials, Russian military experts are talking about a firm human in the loop approach, that humans would be able to control the final actions of these machines. And so a lot of Russian research, development, testing, and evaluation is actually concentrated on that. There's a agency that Russians founded in 2012, which is analogous to the US DARPA, which is called Advanced Research Foundation. We actually quoted extensively throughout the military section of the report. It is working on multiple projects, including the Marker unmanned ground vehicle project, which is a test bed for both machine learning, for computer vision, for speech recognition, for natural language processing, as well as manned-unmanned teaming and heterogeneous unmanned systems training, so that this Marker UGV should be able to cooperate with UAVs. But the ultimate goal is to eventually send such a machine out on a mission once a human operator approved its parameters.
Great. Well, a couple of follow-on questions there. First, so when you're talking about human in the loop, ethical considerations, but also practical considerations, that sounds similar to things that I've heard that the United States and the West are also making sure are part of the applied artificial intelligence. Is there anything about the way Russia is going after this problem that is unique to Russia, or is it fairly similar to what the West is doing? Any nuance there?
I think right now it's fairly similar to the West. And I think that's because of the point at which we are in development. They do talk, like Sam said, they talk a lot about having a human in the loop. I guess, there are some differences that when we're talking specifically about military applications, the Russians do have a riskier or higher risk-taking threshold when it comes to experimentation, when it comes to military operations, and just how they operate militarily. Unrelated, but illustrative of the point, Russian ship drivers are extremely aggressive around U.S. ships, whereas U.S. ship captains are not. But that extends, I think, to the military culture in general. There's just higher risk-taking. So as these systems become more advanced, it'll be interesting to see how much the Russians are willing, how that view of a man in the loop evolves over time. Do they become more comfortable with less control over a system? But right now, obviously there are debates in the UN that Russia's involved with, the US is involved with. I think, and I don't know if you agree, Sam, I think that a lot of the discussion kind of mirrors, like the Russians watch what we're saying. And so a lot of the discussion right now is actually quite similar. And so you're not seeing the Russians like advocating for complete autonomy and no human in the loop, whereas we are. Right now, they're advocating for that as well. So, but it'll be interesting to see if there are differences that come out over time based on the development and the development of greater capabilities.
And we also noticed, as part of our research, looking at the civilian side of things, There's actually a lot of discussion about ethics in AI development and implementation that's going to affect the Russian society. In fact, that is how the Russian government is trying to sell its push for digitization and implementation of AI. This is going to be an ethical approach. People's personal data, personal information will be respected. Russia's flagship organizations like Sberbank or Sber, which is Russia's Google-like organization, offering a suite of solutions and is probably on the cutting edge of Russia's AI and autonomy, RDT&E, when it comes to the civilian sector. They're actually offering an ethical approach to AI use in the Russian economy and society. So in fact, ethics is a rather extensive and active discussion. We're probably not used to hearing Russians talk about that simply because the whole AI debate and discussion within the Russian society and in the military writ large is just a few years old. In fact, a lot of these initiatives began really in the year 2019 and 2020. And so we're still kind of doing the mental switch from thinking of Russia's military not being sort of cognizant of certain types of ethics to observing that the Russian society and parts of Russian military are actually discussing ethics as a norm.
Right. I think you guys make the point a number of times in the piece that there's a bit of a manpower, human capital challenge in Russia of experts and young people that are learning the data science trade. And this is, I guess you could consider it part of like a whole of government effort in order to attract more talent into AI so that Russia can remain competitive.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a very good characterization of it. They have identified the fact that there's just not the upwelling of young technological talent that I think you see in the West. And this is unrelated to kind of spurious claims about Russian demographic problems. That's a different thing. This is more of the fact that Russia is behind as far as the digitization of their economy and just in general life. And so I think they've had very targeted programs to young adults to really try to encourage people and young professionals too. Like if you're in this field, you might get something like a tax credit or have school paid for. And so they're really trying to do this, but it's not just that. It's not just the youth. They're also looking at educating middle-aged and even older Russians that, hey, AI is not this bad thing. It's not going to take your job away. This is here to help you. And so there really is it's rather impressive that they've identified this challenge and are really throwing a lot at it to really try to get the Russian society in general to be more tech savvy, if you will.
And as Jeff said, most of that is going to be visible in the academia. Russians are pushing AI education in universities, in high schools and middle schools. As we were finishing up the report, there were more and more news coming out of Russian academia that they're actually going to stand up BA and MA and PhD type of programs in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So there's certainly an effort. But I also would like to add that Russia didn't really have high-tech private sector for a very long time, in the sense that we're used to that in the United States. And in some ways, that high-tech private sector is only now kind of getting into its own, and it is only recently becoming competitive domestically, regionally, as well as internationally. There's plenty of great information communication technologies talent in Russia. At the same time, as Jeff said, it is very important for the Russian government to foster and nurture that talent, or else it's simply going to emigrate.
So the other thing I would say in the same vein is that one of what I think is probably the most significant challenge that Russia faces is that the leaders in this area are all state owned, right? And so it's kind of opposite in a certain sense from what you have in the West. Not that we don't have state promoted initiatives, but you don't have the same risk-taking entrepreneurial attitude in Russia that you do in the United States. There's some of that, and it's growing, but it's not where it should be. And so a lot of these, and this is true not just in AI and autonomy, this is true for like Roscosmos and space and other agencies. These larger state-run companies tend to be inefficient, prone to corruption. And so they really need to figure out a way to get through that. But this is a huge challenge. So, I mean, I think that the Russian leadership understands that, hey, we want to get to point B and we're at point A, but in order to go from A to B, the changes you would need to make are actually rather destabilizing. And, you know, both the political military leadership and the domestic population are really, really kind of paranoid about instability. Like you really don't want to create a destabilizing situation in Russia, because Russians do not, you know, after the end of the Cold War, they just really don't, they value stability. And so I think that's, you know, getting to a point where you have innovation, risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and that kind of, like I said earlier, that upwelling of innovation, they're going to have some serious challenges. And so it'll be interesting to see going forward. We are seeing the leadership holding people more accountable for not reaching benchmarks in these companies. So we'll see going forward if they're able to make these more streamlined and efficient and really root out some of the core corruption that's preventing, you know, a stronger technological base.
And John, one of the initiatives that we have highlighted in the paper is called National Technology Initiative. So it's a government effort to foster high-tech innovation hubs and to support high-tech entrepreneurs, not just in AI, but in other aspects of high tech. And a short while ago, NTI, which is the acronym for National Technology Initiatives, NTI website had this statement by one of its directors on its website about sort of fostering the next generation of high-tech entrepreneurs in Russia. And I quote, "Everyone for whom the California sun, ocean, and the mountains are important has already left. For everybody else, the sea and the mountains of Crimea are just as good." And so here's the attitude. They recognize that they've lost a certain amount of talent, that they may continue to lose a certain amount of talent unless they do something drastic that would truly attract and allow people to do all of the things that they want to do sort of in Silicon Valley back home in Moscow, across Russian regions.
Yeah, wow. I can almost hear an audience member asking, wondering, well, so there's this manpower, human capital challenge that we've been discussing relative to STEM type disciplines, maybe AI and data science in particular. But so how do you map that onto Russia's like cyber attack and hacking and that type of STEM related competencies? At least it seems like that's something that they are particularly good at. Would you guys say that that's, yes, but that's a narrow domain and there's a much wider requirement space that they're seeking to fill in?
So I think the cyber realm is, especially hacking, is interesting. And, you know, we need to do more research on this. I'm talking to some colleagues in the cyber realm about this. In a certain sense, because that's such a specialized skill, and that is often driven by young, very innovative, very intelligent individuals, in some ways, part of that workforce lies outside of the constraints that I mentioned earlier, right? Mm-hmm. It's a smaller community that's able to focus itself on these types of skills and are not necessarily held back by like the fundamental challenges that Russia faces, as far as like having a digitized economy and things of that nature. And so, but that is, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how, you know, AI figures into this. It can certainly bolster these, you know, the capability. It's kind of a scary thing to think of when you think of combining AI with hacking. You could get, you know, secondary, tertiary effects that you didn't originally plan on, an unintended escalation. But I do think an interesting research question would be, you know, how does the hacking cyber community, how do they relate to the broader technological foundation in Russia? I tend to think they're a bit separate, and that's why, you know, some of these groups can actually be quite effective because it is very focused and lies outside of those constraints.
John, just to build on that, we published our report in late May. Last week, Russian government announced that it is going to host over 100 AI-related hackathons across the country for the next several years. So they're going to look for that young talent. They're going to look for those non-traditional solutions. They're going to look for the best and the brightest, and they're going to try to give them incentives either to go to the best schools or to join corporations and companies that work on high-tech products. So the Russian government is certainly investing in identifying the talent. Now, how successful that effort is going to be remains to be seen. But if we talk 3 years from now, I think we will have a slightly different conversation.
Right. So we've been talking for a couple of moments here about some of Russia's perceived or actual deficiencies related to AI. Are you guys aware of any areas where Russia, their skills or capabilities are superior to the West? And if so, in what areas?
I don't know if I'd say superior. I usually would think of it as peer. But what you do see is especially when it comes to AI and autonomy, is efforts graphing onto areas where the Russian military is already strong. Sam and I have both researched, Russian EW, electronic warfare capabilities, and so you'll see them trying, putting a lot of energy into how can AI assist on the battlefield, making EW systems more effective in protecting your own systems, degrading your enemy systems, targeting. How do you make all that process faster so that you can gain and maintain information dominance on the battlefield faster than your enemy? Another area that I like to highlight is that Russia is very competent in their undersea capabilities. We've always said that the Russian submarine force is actually the strongest part of the Russian Navy. And so you see them applying AI and autonomy to undersea systems and talking a lot about, for example, how can you have a semi-autonomous system help you with anti-submarine warfare? And so that's something that DoD needs to be really concerned about. I can picture something in the future where you have a bunch of small semi-autonomous or autonomous things that you can very easily spread out over a very large area in the ocean, and suddenly that area becomes fairly transparent, right? We always talk about the fear of having a transparent ocean. And so I think that that's something that DoD needs to really, really focus on. There are other areas, and part of the challenge of the report is that it's journalists in Russia don't always understand AI and autonomy themselves. And so one of the challenges we've had is to really kind of bore down into things and say like, oh, wow, this is actually very interesting, or this is just somebody making some hyperbolic claim and they don't really know what they're talking about. But I would definitely, like Sam said earlier, I think EW is really one of those areas that the Russians have really become quite proficient in, and which is really a challenge for U.S. forces.
And I will add that as of 2018, Russian Navy announced that it is working on 17 different unmanned and autonomous projects, both for underwater and surface warfare. So there's certainly a lot to consider here, and they're certainly investing in multiple capabilities. Not all of those projects are ultimately going to be acquired by the Russian Navy. We've seen evidence that certain branches are becoming more selective in how they view such technology. We're also seeing a greater trend away from self-initiated projects being pitched to the MOD actually issuing requirements for specific technologies that they would like. We certainly see that in unmanned aerial vehicle and unmanned ground vehicle production capabilities.
Yeah, wow. The problem space here, or the surface area of the applications that we need to be aware of. Of course, I would imagine that we're developing capabilities in all of these spaces as well. But wow, it's just what a big sprawling problem. So I guess I wanted to ask you both about where is this going? We've had a number of podcast episodes that have talked about, I think one of you just mentioned the OODA loop, or speeding up decision making. So we've talked about the OODA loop here, and this other concept called the Red Queen hypothesis, which is a evolutionary biology term, which essentially means that in order to compete, you have to keep on doing things faster and faster. You have to outspeed your adversary in the long run in order to win. How do you guys think the OODA loop concept drops onto this discussion?
I think that the Russians actually talk quite a lot about getting inside the decision cycle of their adversaries. And so there are a number of things that inform that. One is the belief that the initial period of war is critical in any kind of conflict. And this dates all the way back to the Russian Revolution, World War I, World War II. There's a long discussion in Russia that focuses on that very initial period and how do you define that and what do you need to do. Part of that's also the fact that, you know, we live in a world where you can reach out and touch your enemy almost instantaneously with things like cyber, but then you also have long range strikes, space-based stuff. And so there really is this belief that, you know, you have to, like I said earlier, gain and maintain information dominance on the battlefield so that you can disorganize your enemy and then, you know, give yourself the freedom of maneuver to win early on. And so that's one area that I think is a bit different than the US military. I don't know that we focus on, you know, having been in the Army for 24 years, I don't know that we focus time-wise on how important the initial moments of a conflict are, and the Russians do focus on that quite a bit. As you were saying, I mean, there is a lot of talk about net-centric warfare, getting inside the decision cycle, all of that stuff, and how AI and autonomy can help get you there faster, right? And so that's one of the main areas, you know, support the decision making and things like that are one of the main areas that they're really focusing on in AI and autonomy.
And John, we're actually seeing such decision-making capabilities discussed at the highest levels of the MOD. So we've actually cited in the report an example that the National Defense Coordination Center, which is the central information management node within the Russian military that monitors all domestic and international Russian military activity, will have some form of AI to assist human operators with making decisions about vast quantities of information that they're receiving. Another interesting aspect that we've noted, starting with Russia's involvement in Syria, is that they're now talking about receiving data and managing data in real time with the help of UAVs, with the help of other systems. This is something new for them. And so getting and managing such vast quantities of data and making the right decision faster than the adversary with the help of AI is going to be extremely important going forward.
So where do you guys think that this is heading for Russia? What might we be expecting to see them and how they unfurl this plan going forward?
We're actually witnessing a growth of initiatives, projects, and efforts by the Russian government in fostering artificial intelligence ecosystem across the academia, across the state sector, across the private sector. We're witnessing more interconnectedness between the academia, the private, and the state sector in developing artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other tools. So that ecosystem is growing. It's certainly growing rapidly. It's not going to be without challenges that we've outlined earlier, but the Russian government is certainly dead set on growing the domestic ecosystem and making Russia one of the main artificial intelligence research, development, and experimentation hubs.
Yeah, I think Sam is absolutely right. I mean, it's hard to overstate how rapidly the situation is evolving in Russia and the number of initiatives that they put forward. And so I really think this is a space we need to continue looking at going forward.
Okay, fantastic, fellas. Could you guys recommend to our audience a book or other online resource that might touch upon some of these themes, or that just is related to Russia that our audience might not be aware of?
Well, there's one book that I've read that was very helpful in for the general audience to kind of wrap their head around the larger sort of AI problem in the global sense, and that's T-AI by Michael Kanan. He's now with the Air Force AI Initiative out of MIT. So that was a very interesting sort of summary. And for the general reader, I think it would be kind of important to, if they're interested in AI writ large, to maybe get that copy and look at it, and certainly read our report. Obviously, we would recommend that too.
You know, besides our report, I would also just put in a plug for, you know, the Center for Autonomy and AI at CNA produces a number of reports that are pretty accessible to people that are not AI experts, and so I would definitely look there as well.
All right. Well, fantastic. We will have links to all of these resources in the show notes as usual. And with that, Sam Bendett and Jeff Edmonds, thank you both so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.